Evidently you have questions, so we're here to give you answers with evidence. Today's question comes from the Reverend Dale Shunk. He's a friend of mine and maybe a distant relative, but he's got a great question for us today. It says, Theistic evolutionists claim that the Genesis chapter 1 record is poetry and symbolism, and that when God created the universe, it was not perfect, but only good to recreate itself. What do you say? Was the universe originally perfect? And what scriptural evidence supports that claim? Okay, we're going to break this down in a few parts, but the first thing I want to do is I want to define what a theistic evolutionist is. We need to understand that these are people that theistic means God believers. These are people that typically believe in the Bible, and evolutionists mean clearly that they believe that God utilized evolutionary processes to bring the world into existence. So a theistic evolutionist is one who believes typically in the Genesis account, but thinks that God utilized evolution in one form or another, whether it's the gap theory or other things. So let's examine the claims here. The first thing it says is that they believe that the Genesis chapter 1 account is poetry and symbolism. Okay, so the first thing we need to examine then is basically to say when we take a look at the biblical record, we have every reason to believe that the Bible is the most reliable document of all time. Okay? Science can't help us with this. Science has nothing to do with reliable historical documents. We need to go into what would be called the legal historical proof method to know whether or not what we have in front of us today is exactly what was written down and handed down to us through the years. So as we examine the record through the scriptures, we do come to find out that the Bible is that reliable historical document that we've talked about. One of the big problems here is that theistic evolutionists will ignore the genre of Genesis in particular. The entire book of Genesis from chapter 1 through 50 is a historical narrative. It's a literal historical narrative intended to be taken that way. What I find interesting is that if you hand somebody a math book, they'll know to take that literal and read it as such. They wouldn't allegorize it into some fairy tale story. So when we read the account in Genesis, we have to understand to take it for what it was meant to be written. Let me give you an example of how important it is to take something within its genre. Okay? If I say to you, bears stomp colts in front of small crowd, tell me what I mean. I'm waiting. Okay, you may think you know, but here's the point. You can't know what I mean by that until I tell you the genre. Okay? Many of you are thinking right now that what I'm talking about is a sports headline. Maybe that came from the sports section of the newspaper. Well, that's not what I was thinking. If that was on the front page of the paper, that would mean something totally different than if it was in the sports section. So if we can first grasp that Genesis is intended to be taken literal, then that takes a lot of the steam out of this from the get-go. We go in a lot more into this in our seminar number 3, proving that the scriptures are the most reliable documents of all time and understanding that the Genesis account is intended to be taken literally. Let's go on to the next point here of the question. The next part of the question says, when God created the universe, was it not perfect, but only good to recreate itself? Now this, I'm not going to get caught up in parsing the words. Was it perfect? Was it very good? Here's what's important. Did God allow for sin or death or imperfections in his Genesis chapter 1 account of creation? Was it perfect, or was there an opportunity for some sin and death or anything imperfect to be in there? That's the question, and that's the way we need to see it, and that's what we need to address. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God says, he saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the 6th day. I'm going to submit to you that what God means is it was perfect, meaning without sin, without death, without flaw. And here's how we're going to get into this, okay? I'm going to now give you 4 biblical points to support this thought, okay? The first thought is that Adam and Eve were the first people. And for that, I want to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45, it says it this way. And so it was written that the first man, Adam, was made a living soul, and the last Adam was a quickening spirit. The first man, Adam. Adam was the first man. Now we go back to Genesis, and let's look at Eve. Genesis chapter 3, verse 20 says this. Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. So these two scriptures clearly spell out our first point, which is that Adam and Eve were the first people. Now the second part that goes with this is that not only were they the first people, but Adam and Eve were in the beginning, okay, which clearly is a reference to Genesis chapter 1. And to support this, I want to go to Matthew chapter 19, verse 4 says this. And this is Jesus speaking. He says, have you not read that he which made them in the beginning made them male and female? Adam and Eve were in the beginning. Also in Mark chapter 10, it says it this way in verse 6. Jesus again says, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. So not only were Adam and Eve the first people, but Adam and Eve were the first people, and they were in the beginning. Here's the third part of this. The third part is that it was by Adam that sin and death started. And let's go to Romans chapter 5 for that. Romans chapter 5 verse 12 gives us this information. Romans chapter 5 verse 12 says, wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, that's Adam, and death came by that sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. That was by Adam that sin and death came into the world. Skip down to verse 14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, clearly linking Adam as this one man that sin and death entered by. So here we go. We have Adam and Eve being the first people, Adam and Eve being in the beginning, and it was by Adam that sin and death began. So before that, there was not sin and death. The fourth point to this is that we have some people running around saying that it was only sin and death of people, okay? That plants and that would have been dying beforehand. Now for this, we're not going to turn there, but in Genesis chapter 3, verse 17 through 19, is where God spells out the curse to Adam, that the ground he would have to till and so forth, so that the ground would not be doing what it did before. At Adam's sin is when that happened. Also, you can look at Romans chapter 8 for some more information, verses 18 through 22. This is what's important. God didn't leave room for anything imperfect before Adam's sin. So was Adam standing on top of millions of years of dead things when God said everything was good? No. Clearly these scriptures that we've just looked at spells it out for us that God did not leave room for that. Okay, there's a third part to this I want to go into, and this is a little more scientific. That if you want to include evolution into the biblical account of creation, you have to give me a reason to believe that. I am not under any obligation to take that. Scientifically, I have the proof that I've just laid out. Biblically speaking, I have the proof I just laid out, but scientifically, we have the laws of nature around us that also support the idea that things were at least very good and continuing to go downhill from there to a state of disorder, disrepair, and confusion, from good to worse. Not the other way around, which is required in an evolutionary worldview of things going from little order to more complex and better order. Totally opposite worldviews, in total contradiction to each other. Things in nature, as far as even the second law of thermodynamics, support this creationist worldview without evolution, that things are going towards disorder, from good or perfect that I've just proven to disorder. Okay? So science does back that up. There's no scientific evidence, on the other hand, to support the belief that the world is millions of years old or that evolutionary processes are in there whatsoever. If evolutionists want to believe that, if they want to say that it wasn't perfect, hey, they're free to believe that. They're free to believe that. That's their faith. If they want to believe that in faith, great. But don't go around saying that the Bible has proof to support that. God didn't leave room for that. If they want to say that there's millions of years that fit into the biblical account, also don't say that science supports that. Science didn't leave room for that. Okay? It's just not there. Here's the last thing. Clearly, God has spelled out a 6-day creation in about 6,000 years ago. That's exactly what the Bible clearly spells out for us. If you want me to put evolution into the Bible, you got to give us a reason to believe in evolution. And right at this point, there's zero evidence to support the evolutionary theory or millions of years in general. If God wanted to tell us that the world was created in 6 days about 6,000 years ago, think of it this way. What clearer way could he have spelled it out in the scripture that it was 6 days about 6,000 years ago? In a previous video, we've given you lots of information about how the days of Genesis chapter 1 are literal 24-hour days. We're not going to go into that duplicate information at this point, but watch that video for more information on that. But here's a little bit of extra information, okay? Think about the genealogies in the scripture, that they come up to roughly 6,000 years for the human history. Here's another really interesting part about dating this 6,000 year universe. Think of 4 timelines, okay? A day, a week, a month, and a year, okay? We have physical, scientific information to support what a day is. What is a day? It's how long it takes the Earth to rotate on its axis. Now let's skip a week for a moment. How about a month? A month is observed in nature. Again, it's exactly how long it takes the moon to go around the Earth. And how about a year? A year is how long it takes the Earth to revolve around the sun. Now let's go back to week. Why is it that all the nations on the Earth observe a week? Very interesting. They all observe a day, a week, a month, and a year. Well, where did this idea of a week come from? It came from the biblical account of creation as recorded in Genesis. There's no other phenomena in nature to support that other than the fact that God established it. Based on what we've looked at today, we really have no reason to believe that there's any form of evolution or millions of years that should be inserted into the biblical account of creation. If you want to believe that, go ahead and believe it. But don't say that the Bible supports it, and you can't say that science supports it. So, does the biblical record of a 6-day creation stand up as the true biblical record against theistic evolution? Now we can say, evidently, it's true.